Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I have for you a book shopping vlog and a quite large haul as well. So, I've just come back from holiday. I went on holiday to Wales, and one of the places I went to in Wales was Hay-on-Wye. And Hay-on-Wye is quite famous as a bookshop town. It was the first bookshop town in the UK, and it is a town that is full of bookshops. So it's a very small town, and it is mostly bookshops. I think there are something like over 20 bookshops in Hay-on-Wye. And this kind of began in the 1960s when Richard Booth opened a bookshop there and invited lots of other booksellers to come and open bookshops there. And now there are just a lot of bookshops, which is very fun. So Nick and I were there for a few days and we went round lots of bookshops, which was very, very fun and very cool. It was a very exciting place to be, and there were just an overwhelming quantity of books. So there are quite a mix of bookshops in Hay-on-Wye. There are second-hand bookshops, there are new bookshops. My initial plan, as I was like vlogging going round, was to go through each bookshop in turn and talk about them, but I'm not going to do that. One, because there were just too many bookshops, but also because quite a lot of the second-hand bookshops had quite a similar feel to them and have kind of blurred into one. So I thought I would show you a bunch of clips from my time in Hay-on-Wye and then also talk through some of my favourite bookshops and then also the books I bought, of which there were many. As I said, there are a lot of second-hand bookshops in Hay-on-Wye, and a lot of the second-hand bookshops, the books were all priced at like £1. So I did buy a lot of books. I have never bought so many books in such a short amount of time before. I kind of knew going to Hay-on-Wye that I'd end up buying lots of books because, you know, how often do you go to a bookshop town? And also, as I said, second-hand bookshops, when the books are very cheap, it feels like less of a decision to buy a £1 book than a £9 book. And also, when Nick and I go book shopping together, we're a very bad influence on each other. And I get competitive and I feel like I can't let Nick buy more books than me. I wouldn't want the booksellers to think that he loves books more than I do. So then I buy more books. So I bought a lot of books. So we'll get on to the books I bought later, but I will quickly talk through a couple of my favourite bookshops in Hay-on-Wye. So one bookshop I absolutely loved was Richard Booth's bookshop, or RB Books, is what it said above the door. And this bookshop sells both secondhand and new books, and is massive and beautiful and really, really like well curated. They had a really good translated fiction section and so many other like fascinating sections. We spent such a long time in this bookshop and I bought quite a few things here. I also really liked North Books, which is a small bookshop selling new books, so not second-hand books, which I just thought again was like very well curated. That was just really nice and welcoming and friendly. I also really liked Gay-on-Wye, which is Hay-on-Wye's LGBTQ+ bookshop, which I thought was really great. They had a lot of really interesting books there, and I bought some things, and they were also the friendliest booksellers, I would say, and I just really enjoyed going around that bookshop. I also quite enjoyed the cinema bookshop, which I guess must be in an old cinema. That's the only reason I can think of why it's called the cinema bookshop. But it was massive and it had so many secondhand books. They were all very cheap, so I did buy quite a few things there, and it had a really huge selection. Like, it was just a vast bookshop, and you just kept turning the corners and there'd just be more books. All in all, I just had a very lovely time in Hay-on-Wye, and it was very exciting to go to so many bookshops. We had like a day and a half of book shopping, which was very, very nice. The other thing I wanted to say before I get into the book haul is that on the way to Hay-on-Wye, we stopped off at a National Trust property. We went to a place called Hanbury Hall, and I was exceptionally excited to go to Hanbury Hall because I've never been there before, but I used it as the model for Ludwell Manor in Montgomery Hurst. If you don't know, I'm also a writer. Here is one of my novels, The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, and this is a work of historical fiction set in the 19th century. It's got a lot of big houses in the book, where various families live, and I don't have a very good visual imagination, so whenever I want to describe a house or think about a house in a book, then I go looking online for like the correct kind of house, the correct style of house, the correct age of house, all of that kind of stuff. And the house that is the model for Ludwell Manor, where Felicia Elton lives, is Hanbury Hall. And in fact, like the person who drew the map, I sent them pictures of the houses, so like you can maybe even see the shape of, can I get the camera to focus? I may need to put a picture up separately. The shape of Ludwell Manor here is the shape of Hanbury Hall. So I really enjoyed going to Hanbury Hall, by which I mean going to Ludwell Manor, a fictional place within my book. That was really fun. Anyway, Hay-on-Wye, books. Okay, so as I said, I bought a lot of books. I have a couple of books to show you that I didn't get in Hay-on-Wye, that I have got just over the last few months, and then I have a lot of books that I bought in Hay-on-Wye. I did also go to a couple of other bookshops elsewhere in Wales, so I didn't buy all of these books in Hay-on-Wye, but I did buy most of them in Hay-on-Wye, and there are a lot, as you will see. So I have increased my physical TBR by like 50%, probably, which is quite a lot. But I also feel like, although I did say this year I wanted to try and keep my physical TBR a bit lower, which I haven't done, I did also say that I wanted to curate my physical TBR more, and I feel like I have done that. And what I mean by that is, I feel like there's different ways of thinking about your physical TBR. I feel like there are some people for whom their physical TBR is a to-do list, and there are some people for whom their physical TBR is a library. And my physical TBR has often felt like a to-do list for me. But one, I feel like maybe I would like to try and shift that attitude. But two, I feel like part of the pressure I feel from my physical TBR comes from the fact that it is a to-do list, a reading to-do list that only represents one section of my reading. Basically, I feel like my physical TBR is really dominated by British literature published in the last 5 years, which is fine. That's something I read a lot of, and obviously like I'm in the UK and I'm also like an actively working author, so you know I want to be reading recent books from the country that I'm in. That makes perfect sense, but that isn't the only thing that I read, and I feel like my TBR is so dominated by newish British books and often newish historical fiction, which is something I love, but you know that's not the only thing that I read, and I feel like the fact that my physical TBR is so dominated by that is something that bothers me. So I feel like I have been trying to curate my TBR more so that my TBR more represents the variety of things that I read. So in Hay-on-Wye, I kind of knew that I was going to buy a lot of books because, as I said, how often do you go to a bookshop town? But also I had a few like specific things in mind I wanted to acquire more of, and so I got quite a lot of classics, quite a lot of Victorian literature, some of which I'll read in Victober, which is really nice. I read a lot of Victorian literature, but I don't often have a lot of physical copies of it. I read a lot of it digitally, and therefore I feel like that means I don't read it as often as I want to, because it's not like looking at me on a shelf. And then I also bought quite a lot of like international literature in translation, which I'm really excited for. So yeah, that was all a long tangent. Let me talk you through the many books that I have acquired lately. There are like 30 books, because as I said, Hay-on-Wye is a bookshop town with many cheap secondhand books, and it was exciting. So I'm going to try and go through these books pretty quickly. Okay, let me first go through the few books that I've acquired lately, which were not books I bought in Hay-on-Wye. I have been sent one review copy lately, which is a work of non-fiction, and I'm actually going to probably save it for next year, Lost in July. But I think it sounds really interesting, and that's this. This is Courting Disaster, Reading Between the Lines of the Regency Novel by Zoe McGee. And this book basically is a non-fiction book looking at Jane Austen and her contemporaries and how they wrote about issues of sexual consent in their books. I think this will be a really fascinating non-fiction book. So like I said, we'll probably save this for Jane Austen July next year, but this sounded really interesting. This was very kindly sent to me by the publishers, Manchester University Press. And then I'm sure some of you watch Milena from Milena Reads. I love her booktube channel, and Milena for a while was running an online bookshop, which she has closed down over the last couple of weeks, and she had a closing down sale, and I've really enjoyed using Milena's bookshop over the last few years, and I really loved it, so I wanted to kind of get a few last things from there and support Milena in the bookshop's last few weeks. So I got 2 things from there. One is a collection of Victorian ghost stories, which I might read this October, or I might save for another time. And then I also got this. This is Child of Fortune by Yūko Tsushima, translated from the Japanese by Geraldine Harcourt. This is a modern Japanese classic from 1978, and I don't know very much about it, but I really like Japanese literature and I'm trying to read more Japanese classics, so I thought this might be interesting. And I also got 2 classics from Victoria's Archives, who are a really cool publisher, publishing like relatively out of print, forgotten Victorian books in really nice editions. No, I have not read yet the 2 books that Victoria's Archives very kindly sent me for free a few months ago, but I know that I'm going to be reading this Anthony Trollope book, The Macdermots of Ballycloran, in Victober. I'm buddy reading this with Faith and Books, so I thought it would be nice to have a physical edition of that. And then, because I was on the page, I also spotted Ernest Maltravers by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, and I would like to read more Edward Bulwer-Lytton, so I thought I would pick this up. And as I said, I am trying to have more Victorian literature on my physical TBR, because then I think I'm more likely to read it. So far this year, I have read lots of Anthony Trollope and lots of Thomas Hardy, and no other Victorian literature. I've done lots of rereading, and I've done lots of reading of Anthony Trollope, and I've read nothing else, which is really sad because I love Victorian literature so much. So I feel like if I have more on my physical TBR, that will encourage me to prioritise it more. I've just realised I have another book that I have acquired recently, but I didn't buy in Hay-on-Wye. It was just in the wrong pile, and that's this poetry collection, 2nd April by Edna St Vincent Millay. I read a poem by Edna Vincent Millay, I can't remember where, and I just thought it was so good that I wanted to read more. So I bought this collection, and I will see what I think of it. Okay, on to books I bought in Hay-on-Wye. So as I said, the main thing I bought was international literature and classics, but there were a couple of things I bought that didn't fit into that. So one book I picked up was this. This is The Unlikely Pursuit of Mary Bennet by Lindz McLeod, which is a Jane Austen retelling I've heard really fun things about. And this is a love story between Mary Bennet and Charlotte Lucas, and I want to read that. So yes, probably another one to be saved for Jane Austen July next year. I then also picked up The Architect's Apprentice by Elif Shafak, which is a work of historical fiction set in 16th century Istanbul. And we're reading this book soon for the historical fiction book club that I run over on my Patreon, so I thought it would be nice to have a physical copy of this. And then I also picked up a graphic novel in Hay-on-Wye, which is this. I also picked up the Lindz McLeod book in Hay-on-Wye as well. This is a book called Mamo by Sas Milledge, and this is a graphic novel about a young hedge witch after the death of her grandmother. And mostly I just picked this up because I want to read more graphic novels, and it just looked really, really beautiful. I just thought it had a really gorgeous cover and I wanted to read it. And then I also bought quite a few books from around the world, and I'm looking forward to all of these. So what do we have here? Here we have The Vanishing Cherry Blossom Bookshop by Takuya Asakura, translated from the Japanese by Yūko Maeno. And this is a book about a vanishing bookshop that only exists during the cherry blossom season. And I just thought it sounded very, very charming. And then I also got this. This is So Long a Letter by Mariama Ba, translated by Modupe Bode-Thomas. And this novel is from Senegal from the 1970s, and just sounded very, very interesting. I think it's about a recent widow who hasn't seen her husband for many years, and her reaction to his death. Then I also got Broken April, which is a novel by Ismail Kader, who is from Albania. And this is translated from the Albanian by... No, it's not going to tell me who translated it. That doesn't appear to be anywhere, which isn't great. This novel is from 1982. I don't think I've ever read anything from Albania before, so I thought this would be interesting. And it's about a man whose brother has been killed, and the sort of code of his society is that he must go and kill the man who killed his brother. It sounded really, really interesting. And I also got this. This is Wild Boar by Hannah Lutz, translated from Swedish by Andy Turner. And I partly picked this up actually because of the publisher. This is published by Emma Press, and I haven't read any of the prose they published before, but I've read some of the poetry they published before, and I think they're a really interesting publisher, so that made me keen to pick this up. I think this is a novel about various people brought together by a pack of wild boar in a forest. And I also got this. This is The Summer Without You by Peter Andavovsky, translated by Christiana E. Kramer. The author is a Macedonian author. Don't think I've ever read anything from Macedonia before. And this is the story of a man trying to get over the loss of his lover. And yeah, like I said, never read anything from Macedonia before, so I thought this might be interesting. Then finally, I bought Concerning My Daughter by Kim Hye-Jin, translated by Jamie Chan. This is translated from the Korean, and this is an interesting novel about the complex, tense relationship between a mother and her daughter. The daughter has moved in with the mother and has brought with her her girlfriend, and her mother's not really comfortable with this, and it kind of looks at their tense relationship. And I think this would be a really interesting book. I've heard really good things about this. I haven't heard of that many of the ones I've just mentioned, but this one I have seen around on Booktube quite a bit, so I thought this might be interesting. So there we go, lots of international literature, and then like I said, I did buy quite a lot of classics. So quite a lot of things I bought were Victorian, but before the Victorian things, a couple of other classics I bought. I bought The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith, which I have heard so many good things about from so many different people for such a long period of time, and so when I saw this secondhand and very cheap, I thought, well, I might as well get myself a copy. It's from the 1950s, and I think Ripley is not a nice person, but is one of those like characters who you are drawn towards. I think that is what I have heard about this, and I just always hear very good things. And then I also bought Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. I always hear very good things about Kurt Vonnegut. I know he's an author that my friend Marissa from Blatantly Bookish really likes, and so when I saw this, again, very cheap, secondhand, I thought I would get a copy. This is an American classic from the 1960s, and I think it is a satire about the Cold War, and that's kind of all I need to know. I would be very interested to read this at some point. And then I also bought Death of Jim Loney by James Welsh, and this is a novel from the 1970s by a Native American writer, and it's meant to be really interesting. It sounded really fascinating from the back of the book. I think this will be a really interesting read, again, one I found secondhand, and just thought, why not add it to my TBR. I also got this. This is a book on Brazilian literature from the 1920s. Like, literally, this book is from the 1920s. So many fascinating things found in these secondhand bookshops. So as well as picking out books for myself, Nick and I also like picked out some books for each other. And this is the one of the ones he chose for me, because we've been having a conversation like the day before about Brazilian literature and how much I like Machado de Assis, who's one of the authors mentioned in this book. And there are lots of other authors written about as well, who I'd be interested to find out more about and maybe give a try. So yeah, I think this will be really interesting to dip into. And then I have a bunch of Victorian literature. So I got a nice Folio Society edition of Dr. Wurtle's School, which is from the 1980s, I think, probably. Let me check. Yeah, 1989. And this is a really lovely special edition to have. I really, really love Dr. Wurtle's School. It's a real favourite Anthony Trollope of mine. And I always love it when I come across like these old Folio Society editions of Anthony Trollope. Anthony Trollope is an author who was much more popular in the late 20th century than he is today, sadly. But that does mean that you can get like 1980s and 1970s Folio Society of Anthony Trollope books really cheaply in a lot of charity shops and secondhand bookshops in the UK. So I was glad to find this. In fact, I found a lot more than this. There were a good like 38 Folio Society books of Anthony Trollope books. And I did think about buying them all, but it would have been quite expensive, because they were not very expensive, but they were not £1 each. I resisted and I just got one. I think if they had had all 47 of Anthony Trollope's novels, I might have been really tempted to buy them all. But they didn't. They just had like 38 of his books. So it wasn't a full collection. And I got this. This is Diana of the Crossways by George Meredith. And this is an actual Victorian book that I got for £1. It's not a first edition. This is from 1893, and I think the book was published in the 1880s. It might be that this book is too delicate to read. It feels pretty solid, but I'm probably not going to take it out of the house with me, I don't know. But I would really like to read Diana of the Crossways soon, because it's one of George Meredith's books. It's his sort of new woman novel, and it's meant to be really great. And I like George Meredith a lot, so looking forward to reading this. Like I said, I think I will try and read this physical copy, and if it ends up feeling too delicate, I'll switch to an ebook. And then I bought this very nice edition of The Gothic Tales of Sheridan Le Fanu. This is a really nice edition from the British Library. I have a similar one of Margaret Oliphant's Ghost Stories, and I really love J. Sheridan Le Fanu, so I thought this would be fun. So this has got a bunch of his sort of short Gothic stuff, none of which I've read before. There are 8 short stories in here, and I don't know any of them, so I think this will be very fun. I'm looking forward to getting to these. And then I also got 2 books by Arthur Machen, who is an author who comes recommended by Roy from Roy Reads Anything, who's one of our fellow Victober co-hosts this year. So here I have The Hill of Dreams and The Great God Pan. I think The Hill of Dreams is technically Edwardian, not Victorian, but The Great God Pan is Victorian. And Arthur Machen is sort of a late Victorian and Edwardian like horror and Gothic writer. I'm kind of fascinated to try something by him, so I think I'll probably pick up The Great God Pan in Victober and save The Hill of Dreams for another time. But yeah, I think these will be really interesting. And then I also got myself a secondhand copy of Moonfleet by J. Mead Faulkner, and this is a novel from the 1890s about like pirates and legends, and I've heard this really highly recommended by Kate Howe before, so maybe I'll read this in Victober, maybe I'll read this another time, but it is one that has been vaguely on my radar for a while, so when I spotted a nice copy, I decided I would get it. I also found myself some secondhand Victorian poetry. This is a collection by Algernon Charles Swinburne, who is a poet I've read like bits and pieces from but would like to read more from. And I also bought myself this. This is The Burial of the Rats by Bram Stoker. I keep seeing these nice new Penguin editions around everywhere, and this is a little edition of 5 short stories by Bram Stoker, and I thought I would give it a try because the only thing I've read before by Bram Stoker is Dracula, which I have not read since I was like 18, but I studied it at school and I read it like 3 or 4 times, too many times because I don't really like Dracula. And in fact, I hated it sort of with a passion when I was like 17, 18. And there is a bit of me that would quite like to reread Dracula. But I thought first I would try something else by Bram Stoker, and if I enjoy this then I'll go back and reread Dracula and give it another try. And then I picked up some Victorian diaries because, you know, love a Victorian diary. So here I have Kilvert's diary. So I've heard very good things about Kilvert's diaries before. So Kilvert was a Victorian clergyman who wrote a lot of diaries about his life kind of in rural Herefordshire, and Hereford is very, very near to Hay-on-Wye, so this had like a local connection as well as being something I've been vaguely meaning to read for a while. And I've also got 2 other interesting diaries, both of which Nick found out for me when we were browsing in RB Books. Here we have the Diary of a Victorian Squire, extracts from the diaries and letters of Dearman and Emily Birchall. So I have read bits and pieces of this before at the British Library. I read a lot of Victorian diaries when I was doing research for The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, and this was one of them, but it's quite nice to have my own edition because it like diaries are the kind of thing you can dip in and out of. So I don't know whether I will read this all the way through or just keep it on my shelf for research. And then also Nick spotted this very exciting Victorian diary. So this is tavern singing in early Victorian London, the diaries of Charles Rice for 1840 and 1850. So these are the diaries of a tavern singer in Victorian London. So someone who went round taverns and public houses singing songs. And I'm fascinated to learn about this man's life. I think this will be really, really interesting. So there we go. Those are all of the many, many, many books I acquired in Hay-on-Wye and elsewhere while on holiday in Wales. That is a lot of books. Like I said, definitely the most amount of books I've ever acquired within the space of a few days. But there we go. As I said, how often do you go to a bookshop town? And the majority of these were secondhand. So yeah. I'm very, very excited to read some of these at some point. Like I said, there are quite a lot of Victorian books here, some of which I will try and read in Victober, and then other books I will read some other time. Like I said, I'm trying to like rethink how I think about my physical TBR and trying to focus more on like curating it to have a big mix of the kind of different things that I read, rather than thinking about it like a to-do list. I still want to try and not have books that sit on my TBR for a really, really long time. But yeah. Okay, this is going to turn into a ramble about TBR, so I'll just stop now. So thank you very much for watching. Do let me know if you have ever been to Hay-on-Wye or another bookshop town, and if you like the concept, and let me know, of course, if you've read in these books, if there's any I should be prioritising. So that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.